We have become so accustomed to white people playing roles in fantasy movies as elves, dwarves, and mages. As calls for diversity in movies increase, there have been attempts to add black people and other POC characters to these European fantasy storylines. But POC often seem out of place or inauthentic when they play these characters in fantasy movies or in TV series. I think part of the reason for this phenomenon is that we are used to seeing white characters in European fantasy films or even books. In our minds, a mage, witch, princess, or an elf has fair skin. Elves, in particular, often have long flowing hair, sharp noses, pointy ears, pale skin, long torsos, thin lips, and other non-POC characteristics. The female elves have small hips, thin or slender physiques, and blue eyes and blonde hair. This is why POC actors cast in fantasy films or TV shows seem out of place in those fantasy worlds. I always have this sense that there is something missing when I see a POC character in a European fantasy film, and that to me affects the credibility of that movie. One thing they do is put a black or POC character in armor or costume of a European elf, mage, or princess, and hope that you can just believe that they are part and parcel of that world. They probably do this because they're afraid of changing the successful formula of making fantasy movies. But there's still the issue of credibility. Then you hear some fans of fantasy movies complaining that these black characters have been forced into this fantasy storyline, and there are accusations thrown around that this is political correctness. I disagree. I think that people of every ethnicity can fit into any fantasy world because it's fantasy, not a historical fact. But you also have to admit that simply replacing white elves with black elves may rob the movie of authenticity. So, what should we do about it? You know, as the world becomes more diverse, Hollywood is going to have to reimagine what a fantasy world should look like. That means that they should not limit it to just elves, dwarfs, and dragons. You know, blonde princesses. Or they could reinvent how a black elf looks like and how a black dwarf would look like, and so on. But I am more concerned about African fantasy. African fantasy movies are almost non existent because of a variety of factors. But this is a huge continent full of rich stories. Most African stories have never been heard by most people, despite the fact that they are unique and beautiful with different types of creatures. But you won't find elves in African folktales or fantasy. Elves in Hollywood movies are graceful, ethereal creatures that live in beautiful cities. Dwarves are represented as weapon makers and miners. Mages are super powerful, wise, and prophetic. African mages are different, and there's no society similar to that of elves in most African folktales or fantasies. Kings or chiefs and magical creatures also act differently in African fantasy stories. European fantasy is just too narrow to fit all these different aspects in African fantasy. Now, let's look at what an African fantasy character could look like um, in a movie. One movie that almost got it right was Black Panther. They got the costumes right, they got the weapons right. Even the seer in Black Panther could easily fit in an African folktale. I mean, we should use that as some kind of measuring tool when making African fantasy movies. When you look at this image that I have here, you can see what it looks like. The costumes are influenced by different African cultures. The costume fits this character and makes the character look authentic. No one would look at this image and say that it doesn't look authentic or that the costume was inspired or derived from European fantasy. But people who are familiar with European fantasies will be able to relate to this character anyway. Another image here is of an African mage. You can see there is almost no inspiration derived from European fantasy on this character. This character looks original. If you make a movie where a mage looks like this, people who are accustomed to European fantasy stories will be very interested in this character. I looked everywhere for an authentic black female fantasy character art, but only found a few, but they were not that impressive. In most of the art, you could see the artist was trying to mold them to look like white female characters in fantasy art or movie. That's a very difficult thing to do. In this image, the character looks too modern. I mean, the hairstyle with the earrings and even the costume. She looks like someone you'd find, in a bank or maybe in a law firm or in a church. This is unfortunate because there are so many beautiful black women's costumes that you can find all over the continent of Africa. I'd like to stop this video right here. If you want me to continue exploring possible characters for African fantasies, please subscribe, share the video on all platforms, and tell me whether you agree or disagree with my opinion. Thank you and good luck.